Welcome to the InnoGuide podcast, where we share the works of authors and mentors to guide innovation. I'm your host, Bob Boudelier. This podcast, my website, my newsletter, are focused on helping you discover the secrets of innovation in the age of AI. Since I don't rely on paid ads, I want to thank customers who bring me onto their programs as a technical product accelerator, working alongside their teams to help them develop products smarter and faster without adding risk, while bringing human-centered AI skills into their organizations. Learn more at innoguide.net. In this episode, number 108, we'll be sharing My Best Mistake, Epic Fails and Silver Linings by Terry O'Reilly. Mistakes have a way of looking very different in the rearview mirror. Some of the most famous recordings contain moments that were never supposed to be there. At the beginning of Roxanne, Sting can be heard laughing after accidentally sitting on a piano while making his way to the microphone. And during Hey Jude, Paul McCartney can apparently be heard muttering an expletive after hitting a wrong note. The mistake stayed because somehow they felt they belonged. Legendary Sun Records producer Sam Phillips even had a phrase for this: perfect imperfection. He believed a mistake in something great could be far more interesting than perfection in something merely good. That idea caught Terry Riley's attention because, looking back over his own career, he realized he had encountered story after story with the same pattern. On his radio program, in advertising, and among the businesses, musicians, artists, and entrepreneurs he had followed over the years. And two kinds of stories kept standing out. The first were big mistakes, the catastrophic decisions, failures, firings, lost companies, and shattered plans that seemed disastrous at the time, but ultimately pushed someone towards something far better. And the second were the tiny mistakes, something slightly wrong, accidental or unexpected, that could easily have been corrected or ignored, but instead opened the door to a breakthrough, famous brand, a legendary recording, or even an idea that saved lives. Winston Churchill once observed that bad luck can sometimes turn out to be good luck, and that a great mistake may serve us better than the best advised decision. This is what we are going to explore in this episode. The moments when misfortune becomes fortune, when the thing you desperately wish never happened turns out to be one of the best things that ever did. So let's get started. Steven Spielberg was 28 years old when he got the green light to make Jaws. He had made exactly one feature film before it. His pitch to the producers was simple: watch Duel, his made-for-TV thriller about a man hunted by a mysterious 18-wheel tanker truck. Same premise, same dread, same invisible menace. For Jaws, Spielberg rejected Hollywood tanks and miniatures. He wanted a full-scale, 25-foot mechanical shark that could swim, attack, and roll its eyes back. Nobody had attempted anything like it. Every special effects expert said it couldn't be done, except Robert Matty, who then had to build 3 sharks, requiring a barge, 14 operators, 300 feet of pneumatic hoses, and scuba divers. Spielberg nicknamed the 1.2-ton creation Bruce after his lawyer. But a serious mistake had already been made. Martha's Vineyard was chosen as the filming location partly because the water, even 12 miles out, averages only 35 feet deep. Perfect for a mechanical shark, except nobody had tested the mechanical shark in salt water. When Bruce was lowered into the ocean, he sank. Then the mechanics corroded. pneumatic hoses failed, and the animatronic became almost completely unresponsive. 3 Bruces had consumed close to $250,000 of a $3.5 million budget. The crew quietly renamed the film Flaws instead of Jaws. Sitting in his hotel room, Spielberg asked how Hitchcock would handle it. The answer came quickly. What we cannot see is the most frightening thing of all. He rewrote the script around invisible terror. Shark's eye angles, a dorsal fin, yellow barrels implying speed. John Williams added a 2-note motif that became the shark. The great white doesn't fully appear until 1 hour and 20 minutes in, logging only 4 minutes of total screen time. Production ran 159 days instead of 55, and doubled its budget to $7 million. But it still became the first film to gross $100 million, reaching that milestone in 78 days. Spielberg later estimated Bruce's failure contributed at least $175 million to the box office. In that light, that saltwater mistake was easily forgivable. Our next story is about Joseph Armand Bombardier, who was born in 1907 in Valcourt, a small town in Quebec's eastern townships. He was 13 when he built a miniature locomotive powered by a clock mechanism, painting it in careful detail and paying for the parts with money he earned serving Mass. At 14, he converted a broken rifle into a miniature cannon and detonated it outside the house with black powder. His father eventually surrendered a junked Model T just to save the family car from being disassembled bolt by bolt. Then he was sent to seminary. When Joseph Armand came home for Christmas, he went straight to the garage. On New Year's Day, he rolled out a sled powered by the old Model T motor, steered by rope reins, with a giant plane propeller at the back. His 15-year-old son had just built the first snowmobile. He eventually left the seminary, apprenticed as a mechanic, studied electrical engineering at night in Montreal, and returned to Valcourt in 1926 to open his own garage. But one problem kept pulling at him. Every winter, Quebec's villages were completely marooned by snow. Then, in 1934, 8 years later, his 2-year-old son, Yvon, died from peritonitis. The town was snowbound, the hospital 30 miles away. An unfinished snowmobile sat in the garage. The loss redoubled his determination. He developed a wooden-cogged gear wheel covered with rubber to pull a trap and filed for a patent in December 1936. That single invention made everything else possible. His first factory model, the B7, he marketed by driving across impassable roads and parking outside newspaper offices. After wartime military contracts, revenues topped $2.3 million by 1947. When Quebec mandated plowed rural roads in 1949 and demand collapsed overnight, he pivoted to all-terrain vehicles, eventually producing the Muskeg tractor, still sold worldwide today. By 1958, a personal snowmobile prototype was ready. He chose yellow, the most visible color in the snow. He called them ski dogs, a mechanical replacement for dog sleds. Then a fortuitous mistake was made. The first 4 machines rolled off the L'Auto Neige Bombardier assembly line in 1959 with no logo yet. A sales brochure went to print detailing every innovation and contained a typo. Ski Dog had become Ski-Doo. Joseph Armand looked at the mistake and smiled. He liked it. Ski-Doo echoed the slang skidoo, meaning to get away fast, sporty and memorable and trademarkable. That first year, 225 units sold. 4 years later, 8,210 units sold. Bombardier unfortunately died of cancer in 1964, age 56, leaving a letter urging his children to carry on his work. They did, and by the early 70s, the industry was producing over 500,000 snowmobiles a year. Today, Bombardier spans two publicly traded companies with over 60,000 employees and revenues topping $16 billion. Built in part on a single mistyped consonant. Here's a story about how we remember events can impact our career. A hockey game in 2015 became the unlikely place where a carefully constructed reputation began to unravel. NBC News anchor Brian Williams was at Madison Square Garden watching the Rangers play the Canadiens. He had brought a special guest, U.S. Army Command Sergeant Major Tim Tirpak, the man who had protected Williams and his NBC team in Iraq 12 years earlier. The arena announcer made it a public moment, telling 18,000 people that Tirpak had kept Williams alive after their Chinook helicopter was hit by enemy fire during a 2003 invasion. The crowd gave Tirpak a standing ovation. The next evening, Williams told the story on NBC Nightly News. It was a touching moment. But then something unexpected happened. A Facebook commenter named Lance Reynolds, the flight engineer on the Chinook that was actually hit, wrote that he didn't remember Williams being on his aircraft. Reynolds said Williams had walked up about an hour later after landing to ask what happened. The military newspaper Stars and Stripes investigated and confirmed the account. The helicopter carrying Williams had landed roughly an hour later and had taken no enemy fire. So here's where the story becomes complicated. When Williams first reported the incident on March 26, 2003, he got it right. He said the helicopter had learned that the Chinook ahead of them had taken fire. 2 years later, he accurately told Tim Russert the same thing. But the story shifted over the following years. By 2007, Williams was suggesting all the helicopters had been fired upon. By 2013, on David Letterman's show, he was saying 2 of the 4 helicopters were hit by ground fire, including the one I was in, RPG and AK-47. When Reynolds' post surfaced, Williams apologized on Facebook, blaming the fog of memory over 12 years and the constant reviewing of footage for conflating the 2 incidents. Vanity Fair called his wording elliptical. It circled the problem without landing on it directly. NBC executives were frustrated. The apology failed to contain the damage. NBC suspended Williams for 6 months without pay. He had been earning $10 million a year, so the money wasn't the real punishment. But before the apology, he had been ranked the 23rd most trusted person in America. Immediately after, he fell to 855th, on par with Willie Robertson of Duck Dynasty. A 30-second commercial on his broadcast had cost $47,500. NBC News had generated over $200 million in ad revenue the previous year. Credibility in the news business is the product being sold. The social media response was swift. The hashtag Brian Williams Misremembers produced posts showing Williams dressed as an astronaut with the caption, "It was an honor to be the first man on the moon." Jon Stewart said Williams was suffering from infotainment confusion syndrome, where the celebrity cortex got its wires crossed with the medulla oblongata. What makes the story stranger is the arc that led Williams to that moment. He had become the first network anchor in history to host Saturday Night Live in 2007. He later admitted it had taken him 6 months to say yes to Lorne Michaels. "I was worried that I was going to flush 15 years of my credibility down the toilet." He understood that self-inflicted mockery gives you a hall pass, but he also understood the risk. That love of performing pulled him in an unexpected direction. He told NBC Universal CEO Stephen Burke that he wanted Jay Leno's Tonight Show job. Burke dismissed the idea. He then pitched CBS chair Leslie Moonves about succeeding David Letterman. Moonves wasn't interested either. NBC News president Deborah Turness worked to keep him. At a dinner celebrating his 10th anniversary as anchor, she presented him with the Edward R. Murrow mahogany writing table. Williams announced that he would renew his contract for another 5 years. His NBC bosses broke into spontaneous applause. Less than 2 months later, the trapdoor swung open. Here's a strange question to start with. Who lies about being shot at, repeatedly, on one of the most watched programs on American television, when the claim can be fact-checked in an afternoon? That was the puzzle surrounding NBC anchor Brian Williams after he was caught representing his experience aboard military helicopter in Iraq. He sat across from Matt Lauer and seemed genuinely confused. No obvious motive, no clean confession, just a man who appeared as mystified as everyone watching. Malcolm Gladwell offered a theory on his podcast, Revisionist History. Memory, he argued, is not a recording, it's a reconstruction. The mind quietly rearranges fragments of experience, sometimes without the person even knowing. Gladwell himself couldn't agree with a neighbor about where they were both standing when they watched the second plane hit the World Trade Center. Both remembered the moment vividly. They simply remembered it differently. The narrator tested the same idea personally. He clearly remembered watching the Challenger explosion in 1986 from a Toronto office, sitting beside an art director named Steve Chase, with colleague Philippe Garneau, brother of astronaut Marc Garneau, standing behind them. When he recently asked Steve about the day, Steve said he was in Florida on a golf vacation. Steve was never in that office. Williams quietly negotiated the return. NBC News chairman Andrew Lack agreed to let him anchor breaking news on MSNBC, then proposed a late-night program to capture election coverage, Breaking After Dark. Williams called it self-canceling. Once the election ended, so would the show. Then Donald Trump won. The 11th Hour launched September 16, 2016, and suddenly it had endless material. By the end of 2017, it averaged 1.5 million viewers. The first time any MSNBC program had beaten Fox News in that same time slot since 1999. It closed 2019 as the top-rated 11 p.m. cable news program for the third consecutive year. Forbes declared that if ever a show was created to perfectly showcase its anchor's talents, it was the 11th Hour. So here's the million-dollar question. Could Brian Williams' most humiliating mistake have accidentally delivered the career he always wanted? So let's move on to the night of February 6th, 1964. A 14-year-old kid from Hicksville, Long Island, was sitting in front of his television, watching 4 guys from Liverpool play their own instruments and sing their own songs on The Ed Sullivan Show. You can guess who those were. That was the night Billy Joel decided his life could be different. Hicksville sat inside Levittown, one of the first mass-produced suburban communities in America. Built by Levitt and Sons after World War II, houses went up in 27 production line steps and could be finished in a single day. By 1953, 70,000 people lived there. Not one black family, though, and Joel's only exposure to black music came through the radio. His own family history was complicated. His father, Howard, had fled Nazi Germany in 1938 after the regime seized the family's textile factory. He was a brooding man who played Beethoven at home and left for Vienna when Billy was 8. His mother took odd jobs to survive, and they were hungry often. She was also the one who pushed piano lessons. The rough kids mocked him for it, so he took up boxing at the Police Boys Club and won 23 of 26 bouts. That stopped the taunting. But in 1964, Joel joined his first band, The Echoes. Their first gig paid $15 each. He dropped out of high school and never looked back. What followed was a decade of near misses, The Lost Souls, The Hassle, and then a heavy metal duo called Attila, whose album cover featured the pair in medieval armor inside a meat locker, stone cold dead on arrival. Then things got worse. Joel left Attila, along with his bandmate John Small's wife. Small broke Joel's nose with a single punch. Broke, friendless, and without a diploma, Joel spiraled into a half-hearted suicide attempt, washing down anxiety medication with furniture polish. His first thought, waking up in the hospital, "Oh, great, I can't even do this right." He told his manager, Mazur, that he was done. 30 days to find a deal. After that, he was heading to the Midwest to tend bar. Mazur assembled a 5-song demo, voice and piano, including She's Got Away. Paramount Records passed immediately. They already had a piano-playing singer-songwriter from England named Elton John. Then a man named Michael Lang wandered into the office and heard the tape. Lang had promoted Woodstock. He flew to L.A. and played it for record plugger Artie Ripp, who asked 3 questions. Does the kid singing play the piano? Did he write the melody? Did he write the lyrics? 3 yeses. Ripp reached for the phone at 4 a.m. and told Lang he wanted to sign Billy Joel. Inside the 30-day deadline, Joel had his record deal. Then Mazur and Joel made a classic mistake. So here's the question worth sitting with for a moment. What if the worst contract a young musician ever signed turned out to be the thing that made him famous? On with the story. Billy Joel was desperate. His manager had 30 days to find him a deal, and producer Artie Ripp knew exactly how to read a room and a contract. Joel signed away his publishing rights, copyrights, and royalties. He later admitted he would probably have signed anything. He just wanted to write songs for other people. He never wanted to be a frontman. Then the recording itself went wrong. When Ripp mastered the debut album, Cold Spring Harbor, nobody ran a speed test on the tape machine. It was running slow. So every song played back half an octave too high. At the listening party, Billy Joel sounded like a chipmunk. He smashed the LP against the wall. And with thousands of copies already pressed, Ripp's only move was to send Billy on tour, Europe and the U.S., living out of a camper trailer, surviving on peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, promoting an album nobody could buy. The distributor was having financial problems, and records weren't reaching the stores. The money dried up, and Billy came back with nothing. So he moved to L.A. and took a piano bar gig on Wilshire Boulevard under the name Bill Martin. He didn't want Ripp knowing he was in town, and he played from 9 until 2 a.m. for Union Scale. He studied the regulars every night, the bartender who wanted something more, the real estate agent writing a novel nobody would ever read, his girlfriend Elizabeth working the same room as a waitress. The gig became Piano Man. Around the same time, a Philadelphia radio station started playing Captain Jack, a portrait of suburban kids buying heroin from a dealer Billy had watched from his apartment window. It became the station's most requested song. Columbia Records noticed. Clive Davis wanted to sign him. Billy chose Columbia because it was the home of Bob Dylan. Ripp's contract still entitled him to 28 cents per album on the next 10 Billy Joel records, eventually worth an estimated $20 million. Years later, CBS Records president Walter Yetnikoff threatened to blackball Ripp unless he surrendered the publishing rights, then handed them back to Billy as a birthday present. So what's the moral here? Bad contract sent Billy Joel to Los Angeles. Los Angeles sent him to a piano bar, and the piano bar gave him the song that launched his career. Here's a story about a shoe mogul. Steve Madden grew up on Long Island, the youngest of 3 boys in a half-Irish, half-Jewish family. His father ran a textile business and kept the family comfortable, but the Depression had left a permanent mark. Fear of going broke was a constant topic at the dinner table, and that anxiety would follow Madden his entire life. He was small, loud, and frequently in trouble. Undiagnosed attention deficit disorder made school difficult. What he loved instead was reading about entrepreneurs who started with nothing. Hollywood moguls like Louis B. Mayer and Samuel Goldwyn. Even then, he was drawn to a place where art and commerce meet. At 16, he took a job at a Long Island shoe store called Toulouse. The owner, a 27-year-old, named Lance Rubin, had long hair, drove a Mercedes, and designed his own shoes, and he had wholesalers calling him for input on new styles. He lit something up in the teenager. Madden eventually dropped out of university and went back to work for Rubin, whose wholesale company grew past $40 million in sales. He learned everything: design, sourcing, shipping, selling to retailers. He was also spending his nights drinking heavily and using cocaine. Friends eventually pointed him toward Alcoholics Anonymous, which Madden says saved his life. Sober at 30, he scraped together $1,100 and launched Steve Madden Limited in 1990. He manufactured 500 pairs of shoes and paid his apartment doorman $60 a day to drive him around New York. Madden had no license. Selling shoes out of the trunk of his little red car was $16 a pair. He had aimed at his own generation, but teenagers started buying his chunky-heeled boots instead. His biggest early hit, the Mary Lou. Big-toed patent leather, Mary Jane inspired by 70s glitter rock. It was gobbled up by teens whose mothers wore stilettos. Madden quickly redirected toward Gen X, offering something that looked like an $800 Manlot Blahnik for $70. First-year sales hit $500,000. Upscale stores like Barney's refused to carry his shoes even while their own employees were wearing them. The Council of Fashion Designers of America ignored him entirely. That outsider feeling both wounded him and fueled his drive. Revenue was growing, but most of it went straight back into the business. He needed capital. That's where he ran into Danny Porish, childhood friend who had co-founded a brokerage called Stratton Oakmont with Jordan Belfort. Porish said the firm could take Steve Madden Limited public, raising $6 million, with more than $500,000 going directly into Madden's pocket. The reality behind that pitch was considerably darker. Stratton Oakmont was a Long Island boiler room running a sophisticated pump-and-dump scheme. Recruited flippers bought IPO shares and sold them back to Stratton, creating a legal smokescreen. Stratton then built investor trust through small, early profits before steering them into a hot IPO. When investors committed, sometimes their life savings, Stratton manipulated the share price from $4 to $12 through rapid trades between his own accounts, executed customer buy orders at their peak, pocketed the difference, supported the price for about a month, then let it collapse. Steve Madden Limited fit the profile perfectly. Good product, good story, and an owner desperate to prove himself to an industry that had snubbed him. He said yes, and it would turn out to be a fateful mistake. On the day Steve Madden's company went public, the stock jumped from $4 to $18 in roughly 60 minutes. That single morning generated about $7 million. Madden walked away with $500,000. And then he kept going. He became what Stratton Oakmont called a flipper, buying and selling manipulated stocks on command, funneling profits back into his shoe business. Over 7 years, he participated in 22 pump-and-dump schemes. Sales climbed from $5 million in 1993, $83 million by 1998. He went from an eviction notice to a private jet in under 200 days. He told himself there were gray areas in stock trading. He knew in his heart that wasn't true. When Stratton founders Jordan Belfort and Danny Porish were placed under house arrest, they named their associates. Madden refused a plea, went to trial, and lost, receiving 2 concurrent 41-month sentences, longer than either Belfort or Porish served. In a minimum security Florida prison, he read 4 books a week, taught business classes, and watched other inmates surrounded by family while only colleagues visited him. That loneliness changed something. Released in 2005 and barred from serving as a company officer until 2008, he rebuilt anyway. Revenues eventually surpassed $500 million. Company today carries a market cap of over $3 billion. So what did he learn? Where he once threw shoes across the room when something went wrong, he learned to say, 7 years ago, I was sitting in a jail cell. We're not going to die if this shoe doesn't sell. Here's a story that'll be near and dear to us all. Carl Swanson arrived in America in 1896 wearing a tag around his neck that read, Carl Swanson, Swedish. Send me to Omaha. I speak no English. The authorities obliged. The 17-year-old got to work. Within 3 years, he had built a wholesale food business, eggs, milk, poultry, delivered by one wagon and one horse. By the late 1920s, he had moved into food processing, becoming the first Midwestern dealer to recognize quick freezing technology, the first to automate chicken processing, and the first to mass-produce powdered eggs. His original $456 investment became a $60 million corporation, C.A. Swanson & Sons. His sons, Gilbert and Clark, inherited that instinct. After Carl's death in 1949, they launched a frozen chicken pot pie that became a runaway hit. Then in 1953, they made a colossal mistake. It was Thanksgiving, and Swanson had a problem. The company had massively overestimated demand for frozen turkeys, 260 tons of unsold birds. Without enough refrigerated storage, executives loaded them into 10 rail cars and kept the trains moving between Nebraska and the East Coast, because the compressors only worked to keep them cold while rolling. Then salesman Jerry Thomas had an idea. He'd recently flown Pan American Airways and noticed meals served on 3-compartment aluminum trays. He sketched turkey, gravy, sweet potatoes, and peas on a napkin. The kitchen team engineered everything to cook simultaneously in 25 minutes. But what made Swanson legendary wasn't the food, it was the name. Swanson trademarked TV Dinner, packaged it in a box to look like a television set, and launched in 1954. The same year, 33 million TVs sold in America. They cautiously ordered 5,000 trays, and families bought over 10 million in year one. A cultural icon was born from a catastrophic mistake. Here's a story about Bill Maher. In September 2001, Bill Maher was hosting one of the stranger experiments in American television. The premise of Politically Incorrect was simple on its surface. Take people who would never normally sit across from each other and let them argue about current events. Maher called it a designed train wreck. The show had launched on Comedy Central in 1993, drawing pundits, comedians, and writers from New York's intellectual world. But what made it distinctive wasn't the guest list. It was Maher's refusal to play the game everyone else was playing. He didn't care if his guests liked him. He called out people on both sides, liberal or conservative, famous or unknown. The show was partly a rebellion against what he saw as the suffocation of political correctness, the slow removal of important subjects from real debate. The antonym of politically incorrect, he said, was bullshit. His background had shaped this. He grew up in New Jersey, son of an NBC News editor and a nurse, raised Catholic, but not learning his mother was Jewish until his early teens. His father was funny and prone to angry tirades against Nixon, a combination that imprinted young Bill with a cocktail of outrage and humor. He was, by his own account, an intense, serious, adult-like kid who became crushingly unpopular in high school. After Cornell, where he double majored in English and history, Maher pursued stand-up. His first gig was in a Chinese restaurant in New Jersey. He eventually landed at Manhattan's Catch a Rising Star, where Larry David gave him his first real break. When he appeared on The Tonight Show in 1982, he made Carson laugh with a joke about being half Catholic and half Jewish. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. I think you know Mr. Cohen." He returned over 30 times. In 1997, ABC had moved the show to network television, scheduling it after Nightline. Variety called it the main propeller of growth in late-night ad sales. Then came September 17, 2001, 6 days after the attacks. Maher agreed on air with guest Dinesh D'Souza that the hijackers weren't cowards, then added, "We have been the cowards, lobbing cruise missiles from 2,000 miles away. Staying in the airplane when it hits the building, say what you want about it, it's not cowardly." The blowback was swift. FedEx, General Motors, and Sears withdrew sponsorships, a reported $10 million loss. 17 ABC affiliates refused future episodes. White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer warned Americans to watch what they say. There was another problem. ABC was owned by Disney. Canceling the show would look like buckling under pressure. What would it mean to cancel a show called Politically Incorrect for being politically incorrect? As one former producer observed, it was like a Tarantino standoff. 5 guys all pointing guns at each other. On May 14, 2002, ABC announced cancellation. Maher said he had already started cleaning out his office on September 18. He already knew. What rankled him most was the press blaming sinking ratings when his numbers had held steadily at 2.8 million viewers. 6 days after cancellation, he received a Hugh M. Hefner First Amendment Award, as he told Larry King, "If I had to choose between losing my soul or losing my show, I'm glad I chose losing my show." But privately, he worried the damage was irreparable. So what happened next? In mid-December 2002, Bill Maher announced he was coming back, this time on HBO. Real Time with Bill Maher debuted February 21, 2003. The format was familiar. Politicians, comedians, and activists on a revolving panel. But 2 things changed. It aired live, and HBO had no commercials. No advertisers meant no one to offend. Maher reveled in that freedom. The show averages around 4 million viewers per episode and is now entering its 18th season as of this writing. Martin Short noted during the 15th anniversary special that nothing feels softened to chase a rating. The irony is hard to miss. Advertiser pressure destroyed his last show. Removing advertisers entirely made this one possible. So what's the lesson here? Maher put it plainly. Being canceled seemed like the worst thing in the world at the time. But in hindsight, it was the best thing. This next one's about a cartoonist whose work I'm sure we all remember. Seth MacFarlane was 9 years old when he published his first cartoon in a local Connecticut newspaper. One panel showing a man receiving communion and asking, "Can I get fries with that?" The local priest sent hate mail. The MacFarlane family laughed it off. MacFarlane was born in Kent, Connecticut on October 1, 1973. His middle name, Woodbury, was his mother's quiet tribute to the town drunk. By age 2, he was drawing Woody Woodpecker and Fred Flintstone. At 11, a local paper ran a feature on the prepubescent working cartoonist. He told the reporter he planned to publish books, draw comic books, do television specials, and pursue animation. He was not guessing. He studied animation at the Rhode Island School of Design. His thesis film was called Life of Larry. Remember that title. His professors were enthusiastic and simultaneously horrified. After graduating in 1995, Hanna-Barbera hired him. He worked on Cow and Chicken and Johnny Bravo, but kept quietly polishing Life of Larry on the side. When Fox came looking for a new animated property, MacFarlane pitched a scene, did all the voices, and walked out with $40,000 to produce a pilot. He cashed out every credit card he had, sat at his kitchen table, and hand-drew every single cell. When he returned to Fox, he didn't bring a rough animatic. He brought a fully formed animated film. Fox gave it a slot immediately after the Super Bowl in 1999. 22 million people watched. MacFarlane was just 24, the youngest showrunner in Hollywood history. The show was canceled in 2000, briefly revived, then canceled again. It landed on Cartoon Network essentially for free. The first season DVD set sold 2.8 million copies, becoming the best-selling television-based DVD of 2003. A canceled show was quietly becoming a phenomenon. Family Guy returned after 3 years. The premiere drew over 12 million viewers, eventually generating an estimated $200 million per year in advertising revenue for Fox. And none of it would have happened if MacFarlane had not made a life-altering mistake in September of 2001. On September 10, 2001, Seth MacFarlane gave a keynote speech at Rhode Island School of Design, went out with faculty afterwards and got drunk. And the next morning he was booked on American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to L.A. Severely hungover, he overslept. His travel agent had also given him the wrong departure time, 10 minutes later than the actual 7:59 a.m. takeoff. He arrived at the ticket counter at 8 a.m., and the gate had already closed. He booked the 11 o'clock flight and fell asleep in the lounge. He woke to commotion when CNN identified that the plane had struck the World Trade Center as Flight 11. MacFarlane turned to the person beside him and said, "That's the plane I was supposed to be on." These two mistakes compounded to save his life. This next story is an interesting story about Apple Computer. There was a moment when Apple Computer stood 90 days from bankruptcy, when a man named Gil Amelio stepped in and made a decision nobody wanted him to make. But that was the decision that saved the company. You've probably never heard of Gil Amelio, but without him, there might still be no Apple today. To understand why, we have to go back much further, all the way to Steve Jobs' beginning. Jobs was adopted. His birth mother had one condition. The adoptive parents had to be college graduates. The doctor found a lawyer and his first wife, but they backed out. Then he found Paul and Clara Jobs. Paul was a high school dropout who loved cars and mechanics. When the birth mother discovered neither parent had a degree, she refused to sign the papers, even though the baby was already living with the family. Eventually, she relented, but only after Paul and Clara agreed in writing to fund Steve's college education. Paul Jobs built things in his garage. He bought old cars, fixed them up, sold them for a small profit. He taught his son that design mattered, that a true craftsperson cares about the details no one will ever see. He put good wood on the back of a cabinet instead of cheap plywood. That lesson stayed with Steve for the rest of his life. Family lived in Mountain View, California, in the early days of Silicon Valley. Lockheed, Hewlett-Packard, and NASA were all nearby. A neighbor got Steve into the Hewlett-Packard Explorers Club, where engineers talked about their latest work. One day, Steve needed parts for a project. He looked up Bill Hewitt's home phone number and called him directly. Hewitt was impressed enough to give him a job on the assembly line. In high school, Jobs met Steve Wozniak. Wozniak was 5 years older, technically brilliant and socially awkward, the opposite of Jobs in almost every way. When they sat on a curb talking for hours, something clicked. Wozniak had found a friend who understood his passion, and Jobs had found someone who knew more about electronics than he did. Their first collaboration was the Blue Box, a gadget that replicated tones to trick AT&T's network into making free long-distance calls. Wozniak thought it was naughty fun, but Jobs saw business. Parts cost $40. He sold each one for $150. Wozniak built 100, Jobs sold them all. That proved their complementary skills could actually be worth something. Then in January 1975, Popular Electronics published a cover story about the Altair, the first personal computer, a $495 kit hobbyists could solder together. 3 months later, the Homebrew Computer Club formed in Menlo Park. At the first meeting, Wozniak saw a specification sheet for a processor, a single chip containing an entire central processing unit. He realized he could put computing power inside a desktop terminal. That sketch became the Apple I, first tested on June 29, 1975. First time anyone typed on a keyboard and watched characters appear on a screen without accessing a remote mainframe. Jobs was transfixed. The Homebrew Club's ethos was to share knowledge freely. Wozniak embraced that, but Jobs firmly did not. He wanted to stop giving schematics away and start selling boards instead. As Wozniak later put it, "Every time I design something great, Steve would find a way to make money for us. It never crossed my mind to sell computers. Wozniak offered his design to Hewlett-Packard first, believing it was the right thing to do since he had built it on company time. But HP dismissed it as a hobbyist toy. That freed him to join Jobs full-time. They pulled just over $1,000 and named their company Apple, inspired by Jobs' recent visit to an apple farm. Simple, organic, friendly, an organic word colliding with technology. Jobs pitched the Apple II everywhere. Atari said no. Commodore said no. Atari's CEO Nolan Bushnell turned down $50,000 for a third of the company. He later said, "I was so smart, I said no." It's kind of fun to think about that when I'm not crying. Bushnell introduced Jobs to a venture capitalist who led him to Mike Markkula, a wealthy ex-Intel manager who had semi-retired at 33. Markkula guaranteed Apple a $250,000 credit line for an equal share of the company. More importantly, he wrote the Apple marketing philosophy, built around 3 principles: empathy with the customer, focus on what matters most, and positioning Apple as genuinely creative and professional. Jobs absorbed those principles and applied them for the rest of his career. In April 1977, the Apple II debuted at the West Coast Computer Fair, sleek, sculpted, and more polished than anything else on display. It landed 300 orders that day. Sales climbed from 2,500 units in 1977 to 210,000 by 1981. Apple was now a real business. And that's where the story gets considerably more complicated. Remember John Scully? John had never seen anything like it. He spent his career at Pepsi, where nobody openly challenged the chairman in a meeting. But at Apple, staff bickered and sniped at Steve Jobs without hesitation. Scully sometimes recoiled at the rudeness Jobs inflicted on his own teams. Yet, in those early months of 1983, something remarkable seemed to be happening between the two men. They talked multiple times a day. They finished each other's sentences. Scully felt amazed at how alike they seemed, not in temperament, but in philosophy and vision. Something else was happening just beneath the surface. Jobs was manipulating him. He told Scully he was the only one who truly understood what Apple was trying to achieve. He heaped praise on him, confided in him, made him feel like a soulmate. The manipulation served a clear purpose. Even though Scully was managing the company, Jobs could still manage Scully. And as the manipulation became easier, Jobs grew more contemptuous. One astute Apple employee observed that Jobs was projecting onto Scully attributes he didn't actually possess. That lit a long, slow fuse. But their first real clash came over the Macintosh price. Jobs wanted $19.95. Scully wanted to add $500 to cover marketing costs. The experienced pragmatist told Jobs plainly, "You can have the lower price, or you can have a big marketing budget, but you can't have both." Jobs quietly told his team he wouldn't let Scully get away with it. But Scully won. Jobs would later point to that decision as the reason Mac sales eventually slowed and Microsoft grabbed the opportunity to dominate the market. Mac was revolutionary, and Jobs wanted the revolutionary commercial to launch it. He turned to Chiat Day, co-founded by Jay Chiat. Driven, bold, blunt, and chronically unwilling to take no for an answer, he had dared to build a powerful ad agency on the West Coast in an industry that huddled in the East. Internally, the company was known as Chiat Day and Night. The shop's creative director was Lee Clow, a tall, bearded Los Angeles surfer who wore Hawaiian shirts and sandals even in formal client presentations. He was an advertising genius with an uncanny ability to understand a client's branding problems and inspire great ideas to solve them. He also possessed something Chiat desperately needed. His creative teams adored him. Chiat was mercurial and cracked a stinging whip. Clow placed his body between the combustible Chiat and his creative department, creating a safe space for his people to consistently exceed Chiat's nosebleed standards. Not unlike Jobs and Woz, the odd couple partnership was formidable. Jobs gave Clow complete freedom to present any idea, no matter how crazy. Clow came back with an intriguing theme. Why 1984 won't be like 1984, a reference to George Orwell's dystopian novel. In Jobs' mind, Big Brother was IBM. The 60-second commercial begins with a rebellious young woman being pursued by armed Orwellian stormtroopers. She runs toward a huge screen where Big Brother is lulling a crowd into a spirit-crushing stupor. She halts, swings a sledgehammer, and destroys the screen. A calm voiceover intones, "On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh, and you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984. Jobs hired Ridley Scott, fresh off Blade Runner, to direct this. The advertising industry would eventually call it the best commercial of the 20th century, one that changed the business forever by showing Madison Avenue that a commercial could carry the production values of a major motion picture. Jobs excitedly screened it for the Apple board in December, but it didn't go well. When the final frame flipped to black, the board sat in stunned silence. Marcoule was the first to speak. Who wants to move to find a new ad agency? Several members said it was the worst commercial they had ever seen. Scully, the supposed market master, sided with the board and ordered Chiat to sell off the too expensive Super Bowl time slots that Apple had purchased. The commercial wouldn't run. Jobs was furious. Then he and Chiat devised a plan. The agency sold the 30-second slot, but told the board they couldn't find a buyer for the pricier 60-second spot. In reality, Jay Chiat had quietly told his media department not to try too hard, or risk losing their jobs. Believing they were about to lose $500,000, the board resigned itself to running the only commercial they had. Jobs smiled that pirate smirk. The 1984 commercial aired in the third quarter of Super Bowl XVIII, watched by 96 million people. When CBS cut back to the game, the color commentator said, "Wow." All three major networks ran stories on the ad. The commercial generated an estimated $5 million in free publicity. On the following Monday, 200,000 people flocked to stores, driving $4.5 million in sales within 6 hours. 72,000 Macs were sold in the first 100 days, exceeding Apple's most optimistic estimates by 50%. But that honeymoon didn't last. Mac sales began to slow. The machine was gorgeous but underpowered. IBM slashed the price of its PC Junior, and dealers were stuck with excess Apple inventory. Jobs grew erratic, constantly changing direction. Then key executives began to leave. Jobs started calling Scully a bozo behind his back, bozo being the word he reserved for those he held in deepest contempt. As Scully later said, "I had given Steve greater power than he had ever had, and I had created the monster." The board sided unanimously with Scully, and Jobs attempted a coup while Scully was to travel to China and was caught. When Scully confronted him in front of the entire executive team and called for a show of hands, every hand went up for Scully. Jobs left and slammed the door. Essentially, Jobs was out. Jobs resigned, sold his 6.5 million Apple shares for over $100 million, and kept one solitary share just so he could attend shareholder meetings if he chose to. When Apple's staff swept out his empty office, they found a picture of Jobs and Scully smashed on the floor. Jobs named his new company Next and paid legendary designer Paul Rand $100,000 to create a logo. Apple eventually dropped its lawsuit against him with conditions. Next would target colleges and universities, would not ship before March 1987, and most critically, could not use an operating system comparable with the Macintosh. That last condition meant to protect Apple would be the very reason Jobs would one day return. Next attracted Ross Perot, who purchased 16% of the company for $20 million. He had always regretted passing on Microsoft when a young Bill Gates came knocking, but Next was too expensive. Jobs had promised academia price between $2,000 and $3,000, and the machine came in at $6,500. The factory was built to produce 10,000 units a month. By the time Next finally shipped in 1988, sales were just 400 a month. Jobs eventually gave up producing hardware and sold his pristine factory. He also purchased Pixar from George Lucas, who needed money because of a costly divorce. Meanwhile, Apple was unraveling. Under Scully, the company had grown from $600 million in net sales in 1983 to over $8 billion 10 years later. But by 1992, earnings began to drastically decline. Scully had bet heavily on his pet project, the Newton message pad, and was distracted helping Bill Clinton's campaign. Apple declared its first quarterly loss. over 1,200 employees were laid off, one-fifth of the workforce. Sculley resigned as CEO on June 13, 1993. His successor, Michael Spindler, watched the market share plunge from 16% to an anemic 4% by 1996. Spindler tried and failed to sell Apple to HP, Sun, and then IBM. He was replaced by Gil Amelio, former CEO of National Semiconductor. During Amelio's first year, Apple lost over $500 million. His bigger problem was Copeland, the new operating system Apple was betting on. When Amelio looked closely, he found it was broken and nowhere near ready for its promised 1997 launch date. He needed an alternative. In December 1996, Jobs walked back into Apple's offices for the first time in over a decade and pitched Next as the perfect solution. They settled on $400 million. Jobs also quietly began placing his Next people into power positions. After Amelio gave a disastrous performance at a shareholders meeting, the board chair, Ed Woolard, called Jobs and asked what he thought. Jobs hesitated, did the math, and chose to tell the truth. Amelio had to go. Woolard asked Jobs to return as CEO, and Jobs said no. He had Pixar to consider, and more honestly didn't want to fail. He needed time to determine whether Apple could actually be saved. Woolard fired Amelio anyway. Jobs walked back onto the Apple stage and asked the assembled employees, "Okay, tell me what's wrong with this place." Before anyone could answer, he yelled, "It's the products. The products suck. There's no sex in them anymore." He called himself the ICEO, interim, but he didn't act interim. He dove into product design, rehired Chiat Day, and then asked most of the members of the board to resign. He wanted fresh blood, and he kept only a couple of the members of the board. So what's the lesson in all of this? One of the Apple board members, Arthur Rock, said, "In hindsight, the best thing ever to happen to Steve is when we fired him, told him to get lost. That tough love made him wiser and more mature." Jobs agreed, later saying, "Turned out getting fired from Apple was the best thing that could have ever happened to me. The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again, less sure about everything, and it freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life." So this wraps up part one of My Best Mistake Ever by Terry O'Reilly. It's apparent that in each of these situations, the main character encountered a significant obstacle before they found their way to a successful career. The takeaway for me is that while it's wise to have goals and direction, we have to think of it more as a journey, and we're unlikely to hit the destination on our first try. We'll be sharing many more stories in part 2 next week, so please tune in for InnoGuide podcast number 109. And I always encourage you to pick up a copy of the book, My Best Mistake, Epic Fails and Silver Linings by Terry O'Reilly. For many more examples and the details that we gloss over in these overviews, Terry O'Reilly also has a great podcast. It's one of my favorite. I hope this has been helpful, and I invite you to find more podcast episodes, articles, resources, and information about how I help teams build MVPs faster and work smarter, and how to put AI to practical use at InnoGuide.net. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and stay curious. I want to thank Steve McIntyre for producing this episode, and I especially want to thank you for joining us. That's a wrap.